Yoruba, like others committed to African traditional religions, regard human beings as composite. The spirit returns to Olodumare, the supreme deity, while the body returns to Ile, Mother Earth. After a death, and on certain other occasions, traditional Africans will celebrate in a dancing ritual called the Egungun. The Egungun celebration is exclusive in its performance. Women and children are forbidden to come near this spirit, which is also to come near the dead. But the Gelede is the most inclusive of Yoruba feasts and ceremonies. The Gelede primarily honors the ancestresses, and women and children are essential to its power. Two revolutions directly and profoundly affected African culture and religion. The first revolution was a technological advance that made it possible to establish a slave trade in the Atlantic basin. The second revolution was an economic development that made the slave trade highly profitable. Some 10 million Africans were transported to the Americas over the next few centuries, and their traditional religions went with them.
When Africans were brought to America and enslaved, it was those very priests and priestesses acting in secrecy who served as doctors, for one, but also they were able to keep that identity alive, and they were able to really project a kind of spiritual force and energy that allowed people to survive through those devastating kinds of circumstances.
With the invention of sailing ships that could sail closer to the wind, and with improvements to ship hulls and rigs, Portuguese mariners by the early 15th century could successfully navigate south to Senegal in northwest Africa and still return north. This opened an effective route from Europe to sub-Saharan Africa. A second revolution stimulated the transatlantic slave trade when the Portuguese exported the Mediterranean plantation system to the South Atlantic basin. This revolutionized the economics of sugar production. When the skilled managers of the Dutch West Indies Company expanded this system throughout the Caribbean and North America, there soon followed an explosion in the demand for labor, slave labor in particular. Because of the increasing demand for sugar in Europe, land for sugar production had to expand beyond the small designated farms of the Mediterranean. The plantation system, which originally had developed as a system of capital, now grew to become a system of land investment, industrial processing, slave labor, and a closed managerial system. Slaves were regularly bought and sold as capital assets in the Mediterranean, an area primarily controlled by Muslims and Christians. Navigation between Portugal and West Africa now effectively opened the sub-Saharan slave trade to early European capitalists. The practice of chattel slavery now was widely expanded. The Portuguese were the first to spread the practice to the Atlantic basin, and they were the first to supply the American system of sugar production with African slaves. The Brazilian and South Atlantic plantation system became the model for producing other goods in other markets. In the southern regions of North America, the plantation system was copied in Virginia's production of tobacco, South Carolina's production of rice and indigo, and the production of cotton in other areas east of the Mississippi. All this required a cheap labor force to keep pace with European consumption and demand. And the answer became the transatlantic African slave trade. Of the approximately 10 million slaves who entered the plantation system in the Americas between 1502 and 1860, between 500,000 and 700,000 were brought into North America. The rest either went to Central or South America. Some 30 to 50 million other Africans died either during the ocean crossing, while confined in holding pens at African slave ports, or in African tribal wars, which were sparked by the distorting influence of the slave trade. The first African slaves were initially exported from West Africa But the Portuguese, Spanish, and particularly the Dutch soon navigated their way to Central Africa as well. Traditional African religions are fundamentally oriented towards rituals that seek some favor, advantage, or guidance from the ancestor spirits. The performative aspects of African religion include many phenomena related to magic, such as charms, amulets, shrines, divination, and spirit possessions. In fact, these magical phenomena characterize African religions just as much as the oral arts we discussed earlier. The functions of African charms and amulets are actually related to powers, spirits, lesser deities, and ghosts.
This African fetish, which is really a kamisi in African language, meaning it's a power figure. And it is looked upon as a person and not as a carving, and is used for various methods of healing or revenge or whatever the nature may be. And you notice here they have blades in this fetish, and there are a few nails, where before the colonials came, the Africans used the blade, the same type of blade they would take from the spears. They would use a blade to put into the fetish. To give you a good example, if I'm the medicine man, I'm the chief priestess of spirituality and healing in the village, and one of my villagers come to me and they would ask me and say, listen, there is a pain in my side. The spiritual man or the medicine man would take and drive a wedge or blade in this particular object right where the person is complaining about the pain. Then this object, this fetish, this kamisi catches all of that pain. And the person will come back and tell the high priest or the medicine man, say, listen, I'm all right, I'm healed. And so all these blades that you see mean the number of times that people have come to the medicine priest in order for healing.
African traditionalists experience religions as an encounter with strange powers and presences, both human and spirit. And many of these powers may threaten the well-being of the community and of individual persons. Misfortune also may be understood to be the work of benevolent spirits who may inflict misfortune in carrying out their roles as guardians of tradition. Many misfortunes also may be accredited to the power of witchcraft. Among the Baluba, a witch is a strange and often introverted or antisocial person. He or she may dwell on the outskirts of the village. Such persons are thought to be accompanied by powers that can both disrupt and destroy. Coming to peace with these powers requires powerful medicines and an expert class of practitioners who can root out and destroy malevolent spirits, or at least establish a livable peace with them. Elements of traditional African religion were first exported from sub-Saharan West Africa to Brazil in the 16th century, but they did not flourish until the mid-19th century. Many traditional African cults took root. Brazil's various cults place the spirit medium in a central role, with special emphasis on both spirit possession and divination. Divination evokes the help of the spiritual world for those who are suffering misfortune in the world of the living. It is a stable aspect of mediumship, and in Brazil, divination remains vitally connected with comparable functions in Africa. Afro-Brazilian cults, like the traditional religions of Africa, strongly emphasize performances such as speeches and dances, drumming and sacrifices. Ceremonies are dramatic, colorful, and ecstatic. They evoke the age-old powers and presences of both divinity and saints. Afro-Brazilians have not always been supported or encouraged to openly practice traditional religion. Their religious practices have been both forbidden and prosecuted. To be sure, the association of orishas with the Christian saints has given them a certain legitimacy among the predominantly Roman Catholic populace of Brazil. Afro-Brazilians actually have become very much a part of both local and national government operations throughout the